Hey everybody, Rob Childs here, Rapier fighter out of the United States, and today I'm going to talk to you about bucklers. Now, in particular, I'm going to talk about my buckler eventually, just because I've been getting a lot of questions about the measurements and the why of it, and you'll see very soon why I've been getting those questions. But first, what I'd like to do is to talk to you about some of the traditional bucklers and the problems that I found in the use of them. So, you may have seen these kind of bucklers, typical round shield type of bucklers, and the thing that I did not like about just the standard use of a buckler is that whenever a sword would hit the side of this, for example, you could block, but you're going to slide around the edge and you could still end up getting struck with the sword. It just didn't have any sort of a means by which to immobilize the weapon, and that's really what I'm wanting from the protection that I have. It is how my dagger serves me, it is how you use your sword, and you can serve in that capacity as well. Now, when it comes to the round buckler, such as I'm holding here, this has a little bit of a lip on the edge of it, and it does indeed help to serve as a kind of point catch, if you will, so long as you were to catch that thrust here. It still is not quite good enough as far as my particular taste. The sword can still deflect off of there, and it still leaves the weapon free. It does a great job of providing a greater cone of protection when you're holding it out at arm's length, but again, I wanted something that had a little bit more. So to that end, I'm not the first person to modify a buckler, as you can tell, such as is found with this kind of wavy buckler here. Now, this has a little bit better of a protective catch to an offensive weapon. As you can see by the folds here within the metal, it allows for deflection and also to be able to catch for at least a moment. But you can notice that both above and below, it still allows the sword to fly free. And while this is definitely an improvement and a step in the right direction, for me personally, it just wasn't enough to provide the protection and the control that I'm looking for. So to that end, I started thinking about it, and I thought, okay, take the different positives and negatives of the different bucklers that I have seen, and let's combine them into something that is a little more useful for my particular style. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about my buckler and the reason for its shape and all of the advantages that I have found in my particular use and how it works for me. So in my particular philosophy of rapier combat, I stress to my own students that there is more than one target that you have to be dealing with. Oftentimes I'm talking to my students about how, yes, the body is indeed a target, but so too is your opponent's weapon. The attacks that you make against the weapon are going to have a different measure than that you're going to have against the body, so on like that. Well, when it comes to the buckler, as I said, I wanted something that's going to allow me to attack that other target, in this case being my opponent's sword. So to that end, I came up with a design that works very well for me. Now, what you see here is a couple of catch edges along the side, as well as catch edges along the top, and the construction of the buckler itself is decidedly different than the other metal bucklers that I have seen. Now, because I always teach from a martial perspective, meaning I teach my students as if it was an actual sword fight. Don't teach to the tournament, teach to the actual sword fight, and then it's much easier to take things out because one tournament allows for something and another tournament allows for something else. Whereas trying to add it in because you haven't practiced it and you're doing it at the last second, it doesn't work out well. But when it comes to this buckler, the things that I like about this, first I wanted a construction that was going to simulate what would happen if a razor sharp point was to hit this. And in this particular instance, this is a wooden buckler with a leather cover to it. And if this was a razor sharp point that was coming at me, it would hit this buckler, catch in the wood, and I would then be able to manipulate it and move it about. I can't obviously do that because we're not going to fight with sharps, but what I did do was give the best simulation of that I could by covering this in a thin leather. Now what that does is, because we all fight with these blunts on the ends of our weapons, Lynn, if you go ahead and hold that out towards me, what this does is that when someone was to attack me with a thrust and I catch that on the face of the buckler, what happens now is it sticks and I'm able to move her around anywhere I wish to. And as long as I have that pressure on her weapon, it's not going to slide off and go anywhere. As you can see, I can move her however I wish. If, however, I was not to have that on there, it still provides the same protection, but this leather helps to provide that simulation of a sharp point hitting a wooden face. So that allows me a certain amount of control that I use over my opponent's weapon. Now that is just in the instance where my opponent thrusts out at me and I happen to deflect it and then I can move them. But it also allows me, this exact same principle allows me to attack my opponent's weapon as well. If they've got their weapon here, then what I can do now is I reach out and I punch that weapon and I can move them aside. In one fluid motion, the punch and the deflection, that allows me to take control of their weapon for that moment of time. And a moment is all I need. And now I'm making my attack to whatever part of the body that I wish. Now, again, this is just a thin layer of leather that I put over the surface of this buckler in order to simulate a sharp point striking the buckler. Now you'll also notice I've got quite a number of catch edges on here. There's a specific reason for that as well. Defensively speaking, when my opponent is attacking me, if I have a typical buckler, a standard buckler, go ahead and put the sword aside for now. If I have a standard buckler, I am reaching out and trying to put the buckler in the way of their weapon in order to move that sword out of the way. But when I do that, you'll notice if I have moved their sword out to there, I've now left this completely defenseless. There's nothing there to protect me from a second weapon. Maybe that's another sword, maybe it's a dagger, what have you. So I wanted something that's going to be a little bit more protective. This particular style of buckler, if you'll hold that out toward me now, if I have caught somebody, say for example in the top catch edge, well now in order to deflect this sword, I just turn my wrist and now they are completely to the side of me, right? And you'll notice I didn't have to move my buckler away, so it still exists between me and my opponent, but I still have that control over the weapon and I've also deflected them to the side. Now, as I mentioned earlier with that round buckler and other bucklers of a similar nature, swords that hit the edge of a round buckler will slide right past that and still potentially in a martial context could cut you. The severity would be dependent of course, but I don't want that sword to be striking me at all. So hitting the edge, sliding around below or above, not an acceptable outcome. With this buckler, however, if I was to catch somebody, if somebody was to thrust, cut, whatever the case is, and I get the buckler in the way, the natural tendency is for that blade to slide along there. But here, they're not going anywhere. And in either direction, it doesn't matter. So if that attack was coming from the other side, again, I have those same edges. It's not going anywhere. I find this highly advantageous because for that brief moment of time when my opponent is sliding and catching, remember, it's a fraction of a second is how this game is measured. Every fraction that you buy for yourself is an opening, an opportunity for you to do something to your opponent in return. I don't need to hold them forever. I just need to keep them from sliding around and striking me. This buckler, I have found, works very well in that aspect. Now, as I've said, I wanted something that I can attack this specific target. Now, this is obviously, in a martial context, yes, you could use this and buckler punch somebody in the head, and in a martial context, this would be perfectly acceptable. A lot of tournaments don't allow that, obviously, and for obvious reasons. However, this works very well for attacking your opponent's weapon as well. Because I have the catch edges below, and I have the catch edges from above, I will use these catch edges in order to physically attack my opponent's weapon. Like I said, a lot of people fight in what I call the typical high guard, right? And when I'm in my on guard stance, I will do things of a nature where I will literally thrust out with this buckler. And when I do that, I have now created a catch of my buckler on their sword. An instinct for any swordsman when they're having their weapon pushed away is to push back. Well, they're not going anywhere in this buckler. They're not sliding around. They're going to go exactly where I want them to because I'm the one with the leverage. I will do the same thing if I've got mid-guard fighters or low-guard fighters with the bottom edge. I will reach out and thrust, and I will catch that sword and I will push it aside to wherever it is that I need it to go while making my attack against the body. So one more thing that I found about the standard bucklers that I see out there, and this is something that you can actually, even if the buckler that I have right now is not something that you would be interested in, perfectly understandable and acceptable. There are other buckler styles out there, such as like the traditional that I talked about, where I saw a common tactic for people to get around this buckler was basically just to thrust very hard on the edge and then cause it to turn in your opponent's hand. this is for various reasons. Sometimes it's just because of the construction of the handle in the back. This one happens to be, a polished wood. Other times it's because the handle itself was too small and therefore it allowed it to turn in the hand more easily. That is not something that I wanted. So what I did was I robusted the size of the handle on my buckler considerably. Now, this is just something that you can find at any hardware store attached to the different types of tools of various kinds. Whatever works best for you is what I suggest you do, but the key importance of this is that it is very wide and very thick. And what this allows for, particularly if you've got a leather gauntlet on, is that it is not going to turn in your hand at all. And what this allows for, go ahead and thrust on the edge of it, okay? You'll notice that she's going to move the buckler because my arm and my body are moving, but it doesn't just turn in my hand if I've got a firm grip on there. It doesn't take a whole lot of grip, particularly when you've got a gauntlet on, because that leather really grabs and adheres to that rough wood on the back for the handle. So if you have a buckler like a standard type or one of the more traditional types that aren't simply just a round buckler, I highly encourage you to replace that handle with something like this, and it'll tremendously increase the control that you have over that weapon, over that buckler, which of course will then give you a greater protection against your opponent's weapons. So just by way to recap, this buckler, it's not overly difficult in order to make. If you've got your standard woodworking tools, you're going to be able to have an easy time of this. But the buckler itself is just, for me, I prefer a stout wood, so I've got a heavy plywood that I'm using, but you can use any weight that is best fit for you. And then in order to simulate that sharp point striking a wooden face, all you gotta do is cover it in a thin leather, or in this case I use suede on mine. You've got the control edges that you got here that allows you to buy you those extra seconds or extra fractions of a second against your opponent, and it keeps their weapon from sliding around. You can use them offensively, you can use them defensively without having to actually turn your buckler out of the way. And then lastly, the Grout float handle that I use, you can find it in any hardware store. It's nice and stout, and it will help to prevent your buckler from turning in your hand. And it comes with all the pieces once you buy the Grout float, so you can't really lose as far as that's concerned. If you have any questions, again, please put them in the comment section on YouTube, and I'll be more than happy to get to those and answer them as best I can. In the interim, I hope you guys are all training hard and keeping safe, and hey, I look forward to fighting with you soon enough.